Peemo Ecloternequi by Edgar Varese. Let's take a look at the title of this composition, Peemo Ecloternequi. You have a representation of the title above the podcast screen, and if you take a look at the words of the title, you will see that both of them have those so-called accent marks in them. And take a look particularly at the first word, at poem, and notice that it has a downward pointing accent mark on the first of the two E's. As I've already told you in two other podcasts of this unit, you can use this when you sit down to take the final exam. This word, or this title rather, is one that you can match to a composer and you can match to a musical technique as well. Now, the literal meaning of the title will not challenge you at all. All you have to do is to take the two words of the title, invert them, and you'll know exactly what it means. I'm sure you've already guessed that it means electronic poem. Although the title certainly is evocative, it really does not catalog all the things that you need to know about this complex composition. In terms of genre, this composition is a tape composition. Now, this certainly seems an unusual generic designation, a tape composition. Tape is something that we don't normally associate with music these days. Indeed, I may be the last music instructor on the planet who actually uses cassette tapes in the classroom as a medium for recorded music. But at one time it was the norm for recording music. So, an example of musique concrète, like Edgar Varese's Peemo Ecloternequi, would have been recorded on magnetic tape. That's why compositions of this sort that are pre-recorded, either in whole or in part, are still called tape compositions. It's one of those anachronistic titles. So even though musicians today might create such a composition and burn it onto a CD, it would still be called a tape composition. The performing forces for this composition, therefore, takes its name from the genre. So it's considered to be a tape, whether it's performed from an actual magnetic tape or some other recording medium. This composition was conceived to be a part of a multimedia artwork. It was in fact commissioned by the Philips Electronic Corporation, a manufacturer of consumer electronics, especially playback equipment. And during the later 20th century, when this composition was conceived to be performed, at the 1958 World's Fair in Brussels, artists had begun collaborative efforts very much like the one that we're going to see in this composition. This multimedia artwork encompasses not only music, but architecture, projected images, and a display of colored lights. You may have at hand a picture of the building that was constructed for the presentation of this artwork. And the building itself is a part of the artwork itself. And I have posted a link to a description of a virtual reconstruction of that building, one that no longer exists. I encourage you to take a look at the virtual reconstruction of the pavilion and the artwork before you actually hear the work itself or the excerpt from it. The Philips Corporation wanted this to be a showpiece in every sense of the word, and they wanted to show off their consumer electronics, particularly their speakers. So they had a building constructed by one of the most famous architects of the time, Le Corbusier, and the building itself is a marvel not only of design but also of engineering. It's one of the first buildings to use pre-stressed concrete in its construction, and the design is absolutely spectacular. Within the building, the music was presented to the audience through 425 speakers. Yes, that's right, 425 speakers. And as if it wasn't enough for the people experiencing this artwork to have a sense of the building, all of the walls and the roof are the same planes, and so they would be aware of the walls leaning in toward them or leaning out away from them, and of the experience of hearing the music presented to them from almost every possible angle. They also were experiencing images that were projected onto the walls at various specified intervals, and if this wasn't enough, there were also a number of colored lights that were flashing on and off at specified times. Basically, it was a real psychedelic experience. And the work was a success, and it created an international sensation. It was the work that really established Varèse's stardom. In fact, it was this work that brought him to the attention of a public that he might never have reached otherwise, or at least not on such a grand scale. And numerous popular musicians, particularly rock musicians of the next 2 decades, attribute the inspiration for some of their music to Varèse and his efforts in music. Now, this certainly is not a typical concert work, and the work, of course, is no longer performed today. Its context has vanished. The music was just one component of a much larger artwork. Indeed, visitors to the Philips Pavilion at the 1958 World's Fair in Brussels went there to experience an artwork, not just a concert piece. And this piece of music was not intended for presentation to a static or a seated audience. In fact, what the people did was they filed into the building. They chose a place they wanted to stand, or they could move around if they liked. And they stayed there for a segment of the work, or as long as they liked. So each person's experience of the composition was unique. No two people heard the same sounds in exactly the same way or from the same vantage points. They didn't see the projected images from the same vantage point. They didn't experience the architecture from the same vantage points, and so on. So when you think of Peemo Ecloternequi, certainly you should bring to mind the fact that it is an example of musique concrète. And as you listen to the recording of the work, you will hear all the types of sounds that I told you you would hear in connection with a work of this sort. Traditional instrumental sounds, especially percussion instruments, and Varèse liked these because other composers or composers before his time didn't spend much time with percussion instruments. Electronically generated sounds, electronically manipulated sounds, etc. It's a real feast for the ears, but in fact this work was part of a multimedia artwork. That's what you should remember, and you should remember that although this is one of the great classics of 20th century music, it is no longer performed.